And now it's a great pleasure to welcome our colleague here at King's, Dr. Rosen, who's lecturer in sacred traditions and the arts here at King's, and he also directs the BA program in liberal arts, which is a new initiative at King's, and Aaron's been very instrumental in giving that lift off. Aaron's range of interest is enormous, and I always go to him if I need any kind of judgment on what to look out for in contemporary culture.
It just means I watch a lot of bad television.
Well, it's what some people might think of a misspent youth, but I think it's a thoroughly well-spent youth, and he's an enormously generous colleague and a great resource in terms of the dialogue between religion, theology, and the arts. So, Aaron, great welcome to you. And Aaron's paper this afternoon is Sonofagod, Images of Jesus in Contemporary Art.
Great, thanks, Ben. Funny, I just discovered recently that you could walk upstairs here. I was lecturing here all the other year, trying to grapple my way onto this stage here. And by the way, I'm ill, so if you see me dosing myself with various vials and unguents, don't be disturbed. And also, obviously, don't shake my hand ever during the duration of the conference. So, I think there's a bit in many Monty Python skits which says, now for a little something different. So I suppose that's the pivot here. Joan kindly gave me a very liquid and easygoing remit, which was just to add a fruity aftertaste to the more serious proceedings of the rest of the day. And so I wanted to touch on irreverence in a slightly different context and to look at it particularly in modern art as a way both to reflect on some of what makes and has made Brian controversial, and the different sort of sensitivities that are strummed and plucked and probed by modern and contemporary artists. I think it's probably too soon with England still in mourning to make any football jokes, but go USA or whatever. I'm not really one for major U.S. nationalism, but and actually this is, I think, a good descriptor, this piece of a little what I want to get at today, which is what is that boundary between mockery and piety. And that here you have a work which seems, very lightweight and rather flimsy, but actually kind of prompts some amusing and possibly quite interesting questions. I think there's a soteriological question of whether you place Christ in goal or not, and it's interesting how you place Judas, whether as the sweeper here, and fundamentally I think as a Jew and my interest in Christian evangelism, one question might be whether Christianity should primarily be in an offensive or defensive formation. What can the Python, I think one of the underlying themes of the conference, as I understand, is what can the Pythons teach us about history, but I want to ask, what can they teach us about art history? As some of you will know who've seen The Flying Circus, which ran on the BBC from 69 to 74, really the golden age of British television. I think there's been maybe 3 shows since. But is that there was a recurring segment there called It's the Arts, in which they satirize the pretentiousness of British art critics and have faux interviews that they stage with various made-up sort of literary heroes and musicians. I think one is called Reggie Two Sheds Jackson, because a very British joke, he has 2 sheds, which seemed to be abnormal in his cul-de-sac. So the Pythons have run a series of skits about the arts, and one it actually has the Pope, and it has someone who they say is Michelangelo. I don't know if they mean Leonardo or if they mean to confuse the two, painting The Last Supper, and in The Last Supper they discover that there's a kangaroo in the background, and there's actually not 1 Christ, but 3 Christ, because he wants it to be a real festive Last Supper, as they puts it, not just a final meal or a last snack, but a Last Supper. So it has to be very, very dramatic, and then they go through this question of, well, if there's when the Pope says he doesn't want the painting, then the painter, in this case Michelangelo, says to him that maybe they can come to some agreement that this is, well, if we can't call it the Last Supper, let's call it the penultimate summer, and maybe then it's permissible. So they do a lot of jokes about art history, and actually one last one, which I think is terrific, is that they do a segment that sort of mocks the, I think, quite parochial sort of local British television and radio, where you have, I'm getting so xenophobic these days, it's terrible. I've been 15 years, a little too much bad weather this year. That there's a scene where they say that Picasso has been invited to do his first ever painting in motion, that he will be cycling on around the home counties, making a painting on his bicycle, and then there's a race by all of the other modern artists in the peloton, and they just are calling out sort of these names of, Duchamp, and then it's Mondrian taking the lead. So the Pythons, I guess, are in a way not an awkward fit here, because they do genuinely present themselves as readers of art history. And one final skit where they have all of the paintings in the National Gallery go on strike. So there's a tremendous art historical literacy that underlies a lot of their humor. And so they might, in Life of Brian, not only be punning on the history of cinema and on the scripture, but perhaps also I think we might think of some art historical references as well. And one of the recurring refrains is, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. We hear this an awful lot. In the Python skits, it said once by the Pope and once by a nagging housewife who's telling her kid not to eat the paintings. So I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. And this, of course, is said at the same period that Ernst Gombrich is writing his famous Story of Art, in which he says that, however much we hear this dilettantish summary of I know what I like, it means I like what I know. And so they're sort of using art history to critique that real safety and protection and kind of dike against the avant-garde, which we see in various art forms, particularly in the case of how people appreciate modern art, because even more than any other art form, people feel entitled to say, I know what I like. In the case of my in-laws, that means posters of Impressionists. None of those dubious post-Impressionists either. So how funny can visual art be? That's one of the questions I want to think about, and I've structured this talk with quotations chosen from various Monty Python skits, both from those art historical ones I mentioned, as well as The Life of Brian, and as well as giving us a little bit of a plan as we go through, proceeding chronologically through the life of Jesus. I also want us to think about whether art can really be genuinely as funny as other media. And I think it's not coincidental that most of the truly funny works we think of in art history have a strong verbal dimension to them. That I think, even Duchamp seemed to recognize that in painting the mustache on the postcard of the Mona Lisa, that he had to put LHOOQ at the bottom of it, which would then be a pun on she has a hot ass, actually, in French. So he wanted to sort of embellish that and felt he had to drive the joke home, and that's why we see obviously a great efflorescence of comics and cartoons, but we see less genuinely funny good art. Actually, what we do see a lot of is genuinely funny bad art. I'm thinking of, in the States, John McNaughton's wonderful painting, One Nation Under God, where you have Jesus holding up the crucifixion, and you have all the founding fathers surrounding him approvingly, and then some very naughty academics on the devil side, and then you have, I think, Obama also doing, insidious things to the Constitution. So you can have funny bad art. Another question is, what is the difference between parodying scripture and parodying film within film, and the kind of jokes that artists tend to make? And I think here, just as we have Brian, who is sort of interposed to allow one to make jokes about Jesus in a particular way, just so I think within art history, the joke is not always about the scripture. If we're seeing a Last Supper, the joke is about Leonardo's Jesus. So it is what kind of literacy is, visual literacy is assumed in contemporary art, which deals with Jesus. Some of the sensitivities that I want to identify are rather similar to those of the Pythons, to probably less so class, which is really underwrites so much of the Python's humor, especially that I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. Religious difference, particularly controversial Jewish Jesuses from the 19th to the sort of mid-20th century, whereas a Jewish Jesus is slightly less dicey than it used to be. and crudity and nudity. And I think sometimes what's interesting in tracing the reaction to art which is deemed to be iconoclastic is that it's not so much that it's a representation of Jesus, or that it's saying something that theologically feels dissonant to viewers, but rather they're just reacting, often in the States, to they've seen a penis, it must be an offensive work of art. And that's what we'll see in the Chocolate Jesus, is that an inordinate amount of discussion was focused on by the actually homophobic Catholic League, saying that it was inappropriate to represent Jesus with genitalia. So, and the chocolate actually was peripheral, although it did make it slightly worse to have edible genitalia, I guess. It's actually profoundly Eucharistic, but anyways. And so finally, the kind of point I want to come to is that there's a theological importance of not being earnest. And I think that these works which lie at that perimeter between mockery and piety, and particularly works where that is undecidable, are useful for us as theologians, and I think or as cultural historians, to think about specific issues and really press oftentimes theological dogma to its limits and recognize where it might be in some way stupefying in a very profound way. So this is a work by Max Liebermann, who was head of the Berlin Secession, and really a shining example of German assimilation in the Jewish community. This is actually the second version of this painting which you're seeing. The first one was derided as being too Jewish, which is actually the name of a Jewish museum show in New York about 10 or 15 years ago. But yeah, Jesus, they said, was an impudent little Jewish boy, which I think is actually what some of my teachers said about me in Maine in middle school. But the complaints were, one, that his hair was uneven, which is really bad, as we know. It was not blonde enough, and the hemline was not sufficiently fixed. And he was not wearing sandals in the original, which is why he almost appears to kind of levitate here. So he had longer legs in the original. But what's interesting is it became the cause of controversy, not only because of people agitating, saying that it was too Jewish, but then when it was repainted, people on the opposite side, his Jewish peers, said that he'd capitulated. And so that's often what we find, is there's this kind of second wave of controversy where people then say that the problem with it, with a parody or a satire, but also with a more straightforward representation like this, is that it hasn't gone far enough to emphasize the point that people are looking for. This quote, of course, we're very familiar with. I think we might actually imagine that the Pythons actually were familiar with this work. But regardless, this has been a source of some very interesting poetry, as you see here, by Carol Ann Duffy, specifically rooted back to this image. What's great about this is that Ernst makes it a point of having the bottom spanked so hard that it's rosy red, and the halo's actually been spanked off by the velocity of the Virgin Mother's whack there. But I think it also raises interesting questions that might come back for biblical scholars who'd be more familiar with this material than I am, about the discarded non-canonical infancy Gospels of Christ, which that kind of material, I assume, doesn't make it into the canon, partly because it's so incredibly problematic. If Jesus has powers as a young boy, how does he use those? Is he this kind of proto-Superman that goes around in one of the infancy Gospels sort of zapping his peers who destroy his sandcastles and then resurrecting them? So, but actually I think it gets us to ask very interesting theological questions. And also we might think that perhaps Mary here is either chastising Jesus to teach him about what unfair punishment is, as a kind of foreshadowing of the crucifixion, or maybe it's to keep it's interesting that there's witnesses here. It reminds me of a scene from Christopher Moore's product novel there, Lamb, but that maybe she's doing this in order that the other mothers and other witnesses think that Jesus is normal. So there's perhaps a retention of the messianic secret there. Damien Hirst, who's spoken very not eloquently about his interest in religion, but did grow up Catholic, and is very obsessed with this imagery, although I was disheartened to learn at White Cube the other day that sometimes he just goes through and asks someone to smack a religious title on something when he does some of his, or just rotates through, or literally will pick at random a psalm, Psalm 90. And then, of course, as art historians, this is what you hate to learn, is that you've spent, weeks of your life researching potential connections here, and Damien Hirst has literally gone through the list and picked his favorite number. This comes after his bisected cows, and in some ways, actually, those I think are a more sophisticated treatment that sort of combines a pietà and a nativity when he has mother and child divided of two calves sort of severed in half. But here's a work which I often show my students, and it's always sort of split down the middle and confirming people's own preconceptions, whether they consider this to be a work which is pro-choice or anti-abortion. It's interesting to notice also how that context shapes things, as this was shown outside the Royal Academy, but also here is shown in outside Lever House in New York. This work most people will be very familiar with. With the elephant dung, this is by Chris O'Feely, who then goes on to say that actually this comes out of his fellowship in Zimbabwe, and there's a sacrality to elephant dung, which I think is actually kind of the weaker excuse for legitimizing the painting in some ways. Rather, I would like to think of it as more devout in the sense that this is the Virgin Mary sort of radiating her splendor in a world of shit. You don't have to call it a sacred symbolism of elephant dung. You can just admit that it's dung, and yet she sort of overpowers this in her splendor. There's also this was, of course, the focus of Rudy Giuliani, who first read about it as being dung splattered in the New York Post, that great art historical journal. So that then conditioned his response, and it happened at the time that he was losing a lot of support on the right because he had one policy that was sort of dubiously centrist, which is that he was pro-choice. And so this support was fragmenting, and he was running against Hillary Clinton, and he thought he would quite literally paint her into a corner and say, this is anti-Catholic art. What do you think about that, Hillary, you heathen? And Hillary, of course, is too sinuous and Clintonian to be trapped by this, and says, I object to it, but I defend its right to be shown in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And ultimately, Giuliani loses that debate. Interestingly, no one seems, the critics, partly because people have only generally seen it in reproduction, tend not to focus on the fact that these are all buttocks and other genitalia cut out from pornographic magazines. It's a little bit trite, but I do think there's a kind of a funny play here on cherubs. These are obviously rosy-cheeked in rather a different sense than we think of a Raphael with floating cherubs. But I think that, again, that sort of potential crudity and sexuality actually fits with the Virgin Mary. People thought of it as sort of besmirching her honor, but we have to remember that this is a woman whose son hung out with prostitutes. So I don't think that it's, I think rather if we are in having a more Marian perspective, we might actually think of this as an opportunity for the redemption of the, possibly of these fallen cherubic bodies. This is, I think, an absolutely terrible work on the on my right here by Vanessa Beecroft. She said that she wanted, this is from a trip to South Sudan. She wanted to go to Darfur, but felt that it was ultimately too difficult to travel there, so she settled for a part that was not in conflict, where she could help people by producing high fashion photo shoots with their children. In fact, she had that dress shipped in to present this work. And she nursed these babies, which she said gave her this this sort of deep, physical connection to them. And she said she's, quote, always been fascinated by black and white as colors, which is obviously incredibly dubious and fetishistic, if not outright racist. But so rather than calling attention, as she called it, the sort of double face of the humanitarian project in Africa, she ends up, I think, sort of reinforcing some of these stereotypes of the white savior. Some of you will have seen these works by Andy Warhol the series of his Last Supper, it's interesting that, of course, we know much of the painting of the Last Supper because of the reproduction that was done in Leonardo's lifetime, which is held, I believe, at the Royal Academy in London. And then, of course, it's reproduced sort of ad nauseum. So it's a painting which is particularly prey to, even before the age of mechanical reproduction, to this sort of multiplicity. So Warhol here takes his silkscreen from a reproduction of a reproduction of a reproduction. But again, what seems flippant is actually, I think, quite trenchant here. First of all, General Electric, whose motto is "We bring good things to light" here, that's circling some of the disciples. And of course, most obviously, Dove soap, which has the connotations of baptism and being washed clean, but also, of course, the dove, the Holy Spirit, which is floating above Jesus, and the 59 cents, which may seem inappropriate, but I think might be a way of thinking about sort of Bonhoeffer's claims about what it means to pursue cheap grace. So this is really what is the price of faith that's being assessed here by Warhol, who, by the way, went to church regularly every Sunday without his shock wig on, actually, and was known to volunteer with religious organizations in the city. And really was obsessed with religious imagery in his final years, although I think there's something profoundly religious about most of his work, as Jane Dillenberger has pointed out. Yo Mama's Last Supper, this was another one that Rudy Giuliani particularly hated. I don't think the nudity was helped in his mind by it being a black woman, which Renee Cox deliberately called him on. She has her hands on, I think it was the Oran's posture. My Christian liturgy is not, but that there is this, but there is a kind of a sacralizing and an offering of herself up on the altar here. And of course, as we see in many of the Last Supper images, it's an attempt to utilize one of Western art history's most famous canonical images and turn it around by reinserting those who were displaced and written out of that narrative historically, doubly so in the case of African American women. And then a more cheeky turn here the same year by Sam Taylor Wood, and that's Tracy Emin, famous for her unmade bed that is there in the very center. This is after an art party, so this is sort of prophetic of the bacchanal of the 90s art market. In its sort of obscenity. Audie Ness has heard, I hope actually a lot of you have seen this. I think it's a brilliant work. And here, so it's deliberately, I think there's 14, if I'm counting right, that there's, so that we are not forced with sort of identifying or playing the game of who's Jesus, but also who's Judas in this group of Israeli soldiers. So he sort of destabilizes that, but sort of riffs on even with the sort of halo of the bush that surrounds the central figure. But it's really a question of how it is that we institutionalize sacrifice. That if this is a Christian image about the instantiation of the Eucharist, here it's an image about how asking us to think about how sacrifice is internalized in a national context, and literally how many people may end up sacrificing themselves for their peers. So there's a kind of Jesus dimension to all of the figures. Here, the Judas is very clear. This is from Zhang Fanzi, and a Chinese artist based in Beijing. And the young pioneers here are all wearing the red scarf of communism, but there's one dubious character, sort of Judas Jr. here, who has his a collar of a Western businessman and a yellow tie as well. And so this kind of forecasts a coming conflict, just as the Last Supper is on the eve of the tragic or redemptive events that will follow. This sort of presages a possible conflict coming between a Western capitalist sense of individuality and the larger, more communal identification of the other figures. And of course, the watermelon stains them and makes them bloody in a way. Also, as I was researching this, apparently I was looking for sort of watermelon symbolism. This is the kind of stuff I spend my evenings doing. But there was actually this, the reading of this painting has sort of changed in the last 10 years because there was a great watermelon crisis in China a few years ago that people were genetically modifying all of their watermelons, and they were exploding all over the countryside and sort of erupting watermelons. And people were getting caught in the eye by like watermelon shrapnel and stuff. So this is which in a sense actually emphasizes Fancy's point, which is that what happens when there's a tremendous pressure to conform to a capitalist paradigm and use these techniques to sell your things and enhance and enlarge everything, when there's not a sort of infrastructure built around that to support that and regulate that more efficiently. And of course, ironically, for a critique of capitalism, this sold for $23 million, and the painter used it to buy airplanes. So this is one of my new favorite works by an artist of South Pacific Island descent, Greg Semu, lives in New Zealand here, and so he's sort of lobbing back this accusation of primitivism, not against the Maori, but actually against Christianity, saying, we're derided as cannibals, but what could be possibly more symbolically cannibalistic could you possibly imagine than the Eucharist? Then we have another very politically charged work, and that you can see with there's euro insignia and pound signs and dollar signs. This is Yinka Shonibari, a UK and Nigerian artist, and that's actually pans. You can see the cloven feet there underneath the table, who's replaced Jesus. And he said this is about banking culture in the UK and their potential crucifixion in the recession to follow, which was probably too optimistic. So instead, where I pointed out in the Adines, everyone is a Jesus. Here, the joke is that everyone's a Judas, and instead of collecting their 30 shekels, everyone gets a golden parachute. So. This is, again, a work which is attempts to be actually incredibly, I think, inflammatory. Wim Delvoye, by the way, is also known for creating fake digestives, modeling the digestive system in vast warehouses, and also for tattooing pigs. He's a vegetarian, but he tattooed Sacred Hearts on a variety of anesthetized pigs in his pig farm in China. So he oftentimes uses animals in his artwork. Here, I think in his Stations of the Cross, even if there's a kind of perversity to his imagination, I think what we might see is that actually an attempt to sort of reduce the grandeur of the Stations actually accomplishes the opposite, that we feel seeing the bestiality, literally, and seeing the innards of these animals, the animalistic elements actually help to accentuate the raw sort of physical humanity of Jesus, paradoxically. And I think in that way possibly does a better job than Mel Gibson in terms of showing us raw physicality. And we might also think maybe Meyer Shapiro writes about the Merode altarpiece by Robert Campen, saying that the reason Joseph is making mousetraps is because of an Augustinian reference to the crucifix as the mousetrap for the devil. So in a way the question here is who is being trapped. This work was in some ways very acclaimed, and yet for some it was seen to be sort of reducing the stature and the prominence of Jesus. But this is one of the very first sculptures of Jesus produced in a public setting in England after the Reformation. So actually quite a bold work. And I think that diminutive stature actually causes the passerby to play a role in this sacred drama as they walk by, that they must ask themselves, if presented with Jesus, if presented with Ecce Homo, it's how do they decide? Are they the rabble that sort of denounce Christ, or do they take the initiative to what do they see in this figure? I won't talk too much about Chagall because I've been too saturated in my life with him and I've come to detest him. But that's what happens, I guess, when you write books on things. But so the white crucifixion, many of you will be familiar with. Here on the right is an image which actually riffs on Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece with a risen Christ. Here, that sort of it helps to explain that interesting radiating mandorla. And yet, where Chagall is eminently able to see Jesus as a symbol of a Jewish victim, as he puts it, he has tremendous difficulty, and he also sees him as an artist. He cannot imagine a risen Christ. That's what we see in Chagall, that we have continually focus on the crucifixion and the torment, and then later on, the crucifixion almost becomes like a signature of Chagall. In fact, you can see it sort of etched up there in the corner with Moses. But so here, instead of a risen Christ, we have, of course, a fiddler. So it's a symbol of how the Jewish people in his mind will redeem themselves, particularly through the arts in the wake of the Shoah, rather than depending on any god to do that for them. This is by an English painter, Roger Wagner. If any of you are familiar with the Oxford commute, if you've passed Didcot Parkway, you will have seen these massive cooling stations, which always activates this sort of atavistic Jewish fear in me, and I always feel like I'm looking at something rather dubious. And then I discovered this painting and realized that Roger, a very a practicing Anglican who feels a very deep affinity to Judaism, had sort of seized upon this imagery in the center of the English countryside. This is one of the works that's more sort of genuinely offensive, at least according to Pope Benedict. I'm sure Pope Francis will have a little bit more interesting take on the arts. This was, he called for this to be removed from a gallery in northern Italy. And then an Italian politician went on a hunger strike, which didn't end very well. This is, by the way, this line is from one of those Monty Python skits. Kevin's eaten most of the 19th century British landscape artists. Someone talking about their 3-year-old. So this is that eponymous Sweet Jesus, or My Sweet Lord, that I talked about, made out of chocolate. The original actually was taken down due to protest. Instigated, of course, by the fantastic Catholic League of America, led by Bill Donahue, and so then it had to be removed and put into storage, and subsequently then it was nibbled at by mice, so actually it could lead to a collaborative work with Wim Delvoye, actually, but then it was so after it was put in storage, and so he had to recast it, and that's why you have the more fondue version of Christ there on the right. This work people will be familiar with from the controversy in 2010 from the Hide-Seek exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in the U.S., where this is removed due to, again, the Catholic League, but especially Republicans like Eric Cantor, the newly deflated and dethroned Eric Cantor, who argued, plus you gotta love it when Jewish politicians do grandstanding about the degradation of Christian images, so that this was so offensive. So this is actually produced by the artist in memory of his partner who died from AIDS in 1987, as the artist would himself in 1992. So this is some ways in which work which was in some way controversial in the 80s, just as we see with another example here, Piss Christ, they're continually resurrected, both as symbols of free speech, but also as the apostasy that many would like us to believe they are. This is interesting to note that this was, although it's been savaged in the press in America, its most prominent attacks were in Avignon, France, and also in Australia as well. And yet, of course, as many have made the point before, it feels, in its suffused golden light, feels much more like an icon, and it also is something which is which might speak to the torments and the degradation of Christ in a very Christian way, about how we continue to sort of humiliate Christ. So it could be analyzing a problem which many conservative critics have said that it is merely participating in. And Serrano himself has made the point that he comes from a richly Christian background and considers himself to be a Christian. This asked a great question: was Jesus heterosexual? Which is a very valid question, I think. In fact, I would put that pretty high up in my questions. But this was savaged by Anne Widdecombe, who some will know for her generally talented analysis of contemporary culture, but she said that she ultimately didn't have a huge problem with it, though, because she knew that Gilbert and George would stand before the risen Christ and be judged and found guilty and burned in hell. So she felt it was fine. It was very generous of her. But again, what's interesting is that it's critiqued on the far right, but also on the left, that many art critics in this country said it just didn't go far enough, and that Gilbert and George were being negative about Christianity, but it was such a soft target that they really should do more with Judaism and Islam in particular. And so people were unsatisfied that you just had a menorah and Star of David thrown in here, but it should have been more aggressively anti-Jewish, which is an interesting way to critique something that's perceived as anti-Christian, that is not sufficiently anti-Jewish. This is an artist who, Oleg Mavromaty, who's now in exile from Putin. He was sort of Pussy Riot, the test version. And this is actually for an image from a film that he was sort of starring in about an artist seeking redemption. So it actually engages very powerfully with the Christian story. And but he was denounced to Russian church authorities, who then reported this to the Russian government. And so he, like several Russian avant-garde artists, is in exile facing a 3-year prison sentence. As we know, 3 years in prison in Russia is worth, in the sliding prison scale, is actually much more than other countries. He also does a variety of other self-harming things. There's a piece of his where he sits in an electric chair and you can vote on the internet how much to shock him. And he also has written out the Russian Constitution in protest with blood streamed from his veins into a fountain pen. So I'll just do a few more works of art here as we close out. This work has been removed from Facebook. Of all the offensive things you see online, this was deemed to be the one that Facebook had to take action against. This is by the same chap who gave us the Benetton commercials of Obama kissing Mubarak, etc. We mentioned Zeffirelli. This is a tape of the last, I think, 8 to 10 minutes of Zeffirelli's film, and where Wallinger blocks us out with a black rectangle reminiscent, of course, of Kazimir Malevich's Black Square. And yet, in a seemingly iconoclastic gesture, it actually forces us to imagine and insert ourselves into this image and to sort of fill in the gory details. So in a way, I think actually activates the viewer in a much more powerful way than just sort of being enraptured by the orgiastic violence, say, of the Passion in Mel Gibson. I just watched that with students, that's why it's on my mind, sorry. Another fantastic work by Audie Ness, where it's not clear whether the soldiers are applying the wounds or providing healing, or whether they're creating the wounds by sort of by out of makeup. And so in a way, a kind of allegory about the role of the artist. Just about 3 more images here. This is Robert Downey Jr., held by Sam Taylor Wood not long after coming out of rehab and after her recovery from her second bout of cancer. And so it's a work that's in some ways about mutual healing and the humanity of the figures, that it's a video, so you can see this sort of slightly undulating form of Robert Downey Jr. and is he ultimately lifted up by Sam Taylor Wood. Questions about of iconicity and what it means to enshrine characters in the famous people in the popular imagination. David LaChapelle's fantastic series, I think, actually, of American Jesus with Michael Jackson, always with his glove in this. He's also shown as the Archangel, Michael, I think. And in another work of his, the Pietà with Courtney Love, she showed up to this photo shoot thinking, he said he wanted to do a Pietà with her, and she thought it was a nativity, so she was slightly horrified to see an actor that was dressed up as her late husband, Kurt Cobain. And there you have, as the sort of hagiography of modern culture would have it, that the track marks of heroin usage here have become sort of new stigmata for him. So our very final image, appropriately, always look on the bright side of life. this bell by Glaswegian artist David Shrigley, not to be rung again until Jesus returns. On the one hand, it seems to be sort of skewering Christian faith, right? Because it's done in this very childish manuscript. My parents are elementary school teachers, so I'd say probably a 4th grade to age 10 sort of penmanship here. So is it about the kind of infantilism of Christian eschatology, or on the other hand, is it a profound sort of act of faith within the work of art, even if the artist might disown that meaning? It's interesting to think that it assumes that people will want to ring it, and yet they will somehow respect something. Are they then respecting the regulations of the gallery, that they know not to touch something, or are they implicitly then respecting the religious injunction that is not to be rung again until Jesus returns? And it also assumes a viewer and a context that this, for the future, that this work will be held onto as art, and that people will continue to believe in Jesus, and that this could actually be a work of performance art that is waiting to happen in the future. So this is a work which I think stands brilliantly astride in a similar way that the Life of Brian does, between mockery and piety, and I think in its undecidability gives us the theological territory that we need to be thinking about. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Joan, is it okay to take just a few minutes for questions? So again, we'll just have 5 minutes for questions or comments. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was also meant to ask about the difference between mockery and piety years ago when I was given a Jesus action figure at an Easter dinner that we had with some friends, and it came in a package, and it said, "All new Jesus action figure." It comes complete with glow-in-the-dark hands.
Of course, yeah.
Turns water into wine with a little cup, and multiplies loaves before your eyes, and you provide with loaves. And I read the box. It gave a description of feeding miracles from John and Matthew, and I thought, well, it's a joke. It's iconoclastic. And the more I read the box, the more I realised there's absolutely nothing on this box that suggests that this is iconoclastic. And then I became aware later on that good fundamentalists and Baptists did these to their children.
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah.
So just a comment.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, those things. I mean, it's intriguing also how things then sort of get marketed and how they slide between, and how we draw those distinctions about what we find offensive, and how we sometimes do it based on a constructed image of people that would be offended, when in reality those same constructed viewers are actually the ones who are handing them out as sort of party gifts. Yeah. I think it's interesting in terms of that dimension of what it means to play with things. I think, well, first of all, I think it's this terrible shibboleth in modern art. Everyone says, "I'm playing with the idea that." But this came out recently in some works that were shown at the Jewish Museum related to the Holocaust, where some people had done Holocaust coloring books, and there was also a Lego concentration camp. Poor Lego didn't understand what they were sponsoring, so this Polish artist got them to donate all these Legos and then made Auschwitz models out of them. Poor Lego. But there is a very perceptive critic, Ernst van Alphen, wrote about this, that actually when it comes to the Holocaust, and I would argue in the same thing, same in respect to all sort of things where we have a decided dogma about them, that there is a need for opening up some degree of play and interpretation where not all moral positions are fixed, or at least not at the beginning. So he said he grew up reading Anne Frank, and yet he became ultimately bored of teaching Anne Frank. He didn't know how to re-inhabit that and activate it for people, especially for school children in Holland where that's the preeminent way in which they engage with the Holocaust. So similarly, we have a prefabricated way to engage with so many of the stories of the New Testament, and it's needed to have a little bit of that sort of an irony or a twist away that we can act out and not have the outcome preordained for us, and that actually can make the moral outcome all that much more serious. So works which seem to be derisory actually can, in some ways, be quite frum at the end evaluation. Yeah, thanks.
I took Jesus out of the box, put him on the cheese board, and said, "Look, Jesus Christ."
But there's a scene in Lamb where they have Jesus' face that appears on all the matzah around the area. So yeah, there's good. Yeah, any other thoughts or questions? And please feel free to rip off any of the images with copyright permission for any of your class. I know with biblical scholars, sometimes it's fun to add in something at the start of a lecture. Yeah?
Jonathan.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there's been some very
Sorry,
interesting...
could you summarize just what
Yeah,
that
how does it differ between showing this in the context of the UK at the Royal Academy, where a lot of the opprobrium centered on an image of Myra Hindley, who was the murderess of the Moors, who was complicit in the murder of several children and then sexual assaults and then burying them in the Moors. And there, that was the focus and sensation, even though in Britain, Chris O'Feely's work was on display, that was deemed to be the most offensive. That was interesting, by the way, when it comes to sort of moral equivocation, because there you had Myra Hindley, the murderess, who was then writing a letter from prison saying to people, this is a serious topic, you ought not to be doing that. And then sort of the awkward position of then listening to Myra Hindley for advice about what was inflammatory ethically. When this moves to the States, it's interesting, of course, that it really just gets picked up. It could easily have never happened that this was controversial. It's because of those series of political complications involving Giuliani that his office had actually already congratulated the Brooklyn Museum on the show, saying it'd be a great cultural journey or something. But then it then decided to seize upon it and fan these kind of flames. And it's predictable that sensation in the States focused particularly on the Chapman brothers, so it was, well, that's actually a fairly monstrous piece, but where about sort of children whose sexual organs are all sort of misplaced and then amalgamated into one sort of sexual child centipede, if you will. So that was one sort of focus, and then it was twinned with this. And also protests from PETA. So it was interesting. There's been some interesting analysis of asking people who went to the exhibition and surveying them, and also doing some of the demographics. What's interesting, though, is that I wouldn't want to overly caricaturize the right, because I think what's interesting about that exhibition is it showed that that people, even if they disliked this art, many Republicans still felt that it wasn't the right of the government to intrude upon that. So there wasn't a complete uniformity of perspective that we might think about there. But it's not surprising that this was utilized as a symbol, and particularly seen as anti-Catholic. The other interesting thing about the demographics of that show, and which I think is insufficiently witnessed, is anytime you're sampling that, people were surprised, like, there was a lot of Jews going to exhibitions. It's like, it's in New York, it's in Brooklyn, what do you expect? So that kind of tends to skew some of their results that are done by, what would be more interesting is who's heard about that work in Kansas at that time and what their perceptions were.
I'm going to draw stumps at this point, but Aaron, let me say that there's no evidence at all that you crawled from your sickbed to speak to us because of the sheer energy and bounce you put into your talk. So thank you very much for that, and it's a perfect transition to... It's the perfect transition to tonight's dinner and speech, I suspect, where I hope some of the same energy and humour will be evident.